Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, welcome to another episode of Sapient Thoughts, where we discuss theophilosophical issues, where we provide answers to contentions against Islam, and where we provide a robust case for the veracity of Islam. In this particular episode, which is one of a multi-part series, we're going to be discussing the topic of beauty and the recognition of God. Now, there's an important note here. Before you start to engage with this episode, you watch this episode and the ones that follow that are part of the series, it is extremely important that you check out the series that is called Worldview and the Fitrah. So, because a lot of the topics, as we're going to be talking about them today, are related to that series, and assume that you have some familiarity with the concept of worldviews and the concept of the Fitrah. So with that said, let me start in earnest. First and foremost, let's now consider the world that we live in. Now the thing is, when you go to, let's say, certain social media, when you think about how the internet itself works, how politics works, we live in very tumultuous times. In fact, you have Rick Enfield who says, we're in a post-truth world with eroding trust and accountability. It can't end well. When you look at, let's say, the society in the United States, and you look at the culture in the United States, and you look at the politics in the United States, and I'm speaking because I'm from the US, and so I have somewhat of a pulse on what's going on over there. When we reflect upon that, we see that there is this erosion, as Nick Enfield said, of a type of trust. So you have people on certain sides of the political spectrum who, let's say, they don't trust scientists. And so, certain people, when they're presented with evidence about something like the environment or environmental sciences, global warming, they have a distrust for scientists. Other people may have a distrust for the government itself. When it comes to certain governmental policies and the idea that elections would be fair and so on and so forth. And so this distrust or this mistrust of various institutes, various figures, various power structures, if that's what we want to call them, is actually leading to quite a problem within society. And this mistrust is not misfounded, in the sense that when you think about just how the internet itself functions, if you were to do a Google search, for instance, the Google search has been put together such that it searches based on the data it's collected on you. So for instance, when you now do a search on Google, let's say, culture change is, and the thing that when Google fills in what comes after it, depending on all of the information that Google has gathered about you, that's what will come up. So for instance, you can have a number of different things, a number of different search results. If you type in global or climate change is, so it could be climate change is natural. Now this is one person. Another person, it could say something completely different. Global climate change is a hoax. Climate change is real, whatever it might be, but that's all dependent upon all of the data that they've collected about each individual. Now that data that's collected on you, on me, on all of us who use Google and how use the internet, we understand that the purpose of that data is to formulate a type of avatar, a type of sampling of who you would be, or like an avatar of you. And then that avatar is used to basically sell ads. And so a lot of the information that we get from the internet isn't really based on some sort of truth metric, but rather it's based on a profit maximization metric or an ad selling metric. So when people are exposed to information, there's this concept of how do we know who to trust? And this has proliferated in the age of the internet, and mainly because of this very idea of data collection and data being sold and so on and so forth. Now, the topic is not about that at all, but there's a central thesis to this topic. And that central thesis is as follows. With all this information that's out there in cyberspace, on the internet, and you're not really sure what to take in, what not to take in, what to trust, what not to trust. So how, in this type of climate, how do we know what information is true? How can we recognize truth? So the central thesis for this series is that the greater your exposure to natural beauty, the greater your ability to see truth as it really is. So that's the central thesis. Now, this particular thesis has a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that that there is some sort of impediment to seeing the truth. And now someone may say, well, wait a minute, how is there an impediment to seeing the truth? Like, I can look at something, I have my mind, and I can think about it, and I can reach rational conclusions, and so I know something when it's true. So I wanted to start off with this particular assumption to basically show that a lot of times we can't necessarily trust ourselves when it comes to our cognition. Our cognition, our ability to think, sometimes can be impeded by factors that are outside of our control. Let me address this particular area, and that would be the idea that, can we trust yourself? Can you trust yourself to see truth as it really is? So there was a certain experiment that was done, and this experiment was done in the 1960s, where a couple of lines were presented to a study group, a group that was called in. They were subjects, and they were presented with these two lines. These two lines are known as the Franz-Muller-Lyer lines, or the Franz-Muller-Lyer experiment. And these lines, when you look at a diagram of these lines, you can see that one of these lines has kind of arrows pointing downwards on both sides of the line, and another one of the lines next to each other, the one that's next to it, has lines that are pointing outwards. Now, when a person looks at those lines, one line is or looks longer than the other, or seems longer than the other. And when people were put into the test to see, all right, well, what do they see exactly? How does their ocular perception, how true is that? Because the reality is that these lines, in fact, when you look at the center part of this line, the central part of the line is the same length. Yet, when participants were asked which line is longer, most participants pointed towards one of the lines, that this line was indeed longer, and they said that when they asked participants how much longer, it went from 13 to 20% longer than the other line. When, remember, in actuality, these lines were the same length. So what they concluded was that this you can say optical illusion was universal. It was transcultural. It was anyone that's exposed to this particular illusion, or these two lines, or at least most people, would see the lines as a different length. Now the thing is that this experiment was done in the 1960s, and for quite some time this was the assumption that most people who see these lines see them as being unequal, with one line being longer than the other one, and that this occurs universally. So this is transcultural, perhaps transhistoric. It's just that's how it is. Now researchers later on, perhaps in the 70s or 80s, they wanted to know, is this particular phenomena of someone seeing the lines as different lengths, which in fact are the same length, is this true across cultures? Is it true across different communities, different people coming from different countries, for instance? And so when experimenters asked the question about is this particular phenomena transcultural, they had people from other parts of the world that were outside of the Western world, because the experiment in the 60s was done in, I believe, Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, and a few other places within the United States. And so when this experiment was done in other places like England or Australia and so on and so forth, they found that the phenomena was pretty much the same. And so for a long time it was concluded that this is a transcultural phenomena. It's a universal phenomena. But people wanted to know that if a person is outside of that community of people who are known as weird. Now you might be like, wait a minute, weird people? No, you see, weird people is, social psychologists came up with an acronym that kind of categorized a certain group of people. And this acronym spells the word weird, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So a person that's coming from the Western world, and who comes from, let's say, the educated part of the world, industrialized part of the world, rich, and that which is democratic, these communities or these people, this group of people, are called weird. So they wanted to know, while there seems to be a universal here when it comes to people who are from the weird community, is this true with other communities? And so there were two particular tribes where they found that this phenomena, by and large, didn't occur. There was a tribe from northern Angola, known as the Suku tribe, and one from the Ivory Coast, known as the Biti tribe. Now, both of these tribes, when they were exposed to the same lines, by and large, they found that the lines were the same length. So now researchers thought, well, you've got people from different parts of the world, and yet people who are weird, by and large, see the lines as being of different length, and people from these particular two tribes, the Suku tribe and the Biti tribe, they see them by and large, substantially see the lines as the same length. So what can explain this difference? Well, one of the areas that researchers looked at was the architecture in which these communities lived. In other words, when you look at people who come from the Western world, from the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, their architecture, what surrounds them, is generally geometrically angular. In other words, there's a lot of straight lines and there's corners and things like that. And so when someone is exposed to that sort of architecture, naturally they understand, or their ocular perception, their ability to see, is determined by those sort of angular structures. So when they see lines, it's a type of depth perception that happens. And that's why when they see these two straight lines, because of what environment they've been living in, again, geometrically angular, they see these lines as two different lengths. However, when you look at the Suku tribe and the Biti tribe, their architecture, the houses they live in, were devoid of this type of strict angular architecture. Rather, it was more round, and they spent more time outdoors. So if you think about the natural world, you think about the places they were living, when you look at trees and rivers and things like that, you don't find those distinct angular structures. So one of the conclusions, or perhaps conclusions, that can be reached is that one's living conditions, the architecture which one surrounds oneself, actually has an effect on something like ocular perception, something like how we perceive things by way of vision. And this tells a lot about the idea about, can we trust ourselves? Because the main way in which we gather information is by way of the senses. And so if the senses can be wrong, and of course we can test those senses by way of other senses, point being is that there is the idea that when it comes to trusting oneself, there can be issues, and those issues can come from the environment that a person is in. Now, in the next video, we're going to look at another, you can say, epistemic limitation. And what that epistemic or cognitive limitation has to do with, can you trust other people? Because if we say that, okay, we can't trust ourselves 100%, one way of extending that cognitive bias or that cognitive limitation is by gathering information from other people. And the simplest way to think about this is that when we have epistemic limitations, how much information can we really, completely understand as a single person or as a single individual? It's very limited, and hence that's why we go to a doctor, because we now know that not all of us can go to medical school, understand everything there is to the body, and come up with medical conclusions. Similarly, a person goes to the mechanic. A person goes to some they trust the pilot of a plane. All of those, all of that trust we have in other people is to expand our cognitive, our epistemic limitations. And thus, what we want to look at, and what we will look at in the next episode, is that, can we trust others? So if there's a certain issue when it comes to trusting ourselves and our own cognition, that there are certain limits, are those limits also present when we think about others, doctors, whether that be the pilot of a plane, the mechanic? Is that fair enough, or is that good enough for us to give us access to truth as it really is? So with that said, I will see you guys in the next episode. This is Fahad Taslim, and these are Sapient Thoughts.